"Excuse me, ma'am, this section is for elite passengers only." The words cut through the cabin like a blade, crisp and loud, echoing from the mouth of the flight attendant. Juliet West. Her tone was sharp and her eyes unwavering as they landed on a calm, soft-spoken black woman in her 30s, seated quietly in first class with a book open in her lap. The woman looked up, composed and unbothered, and replied in a steady voice, "I believe this is my seat." But Juliet wasn't satisfied. Her expression turned icy, her voice harder. "If you don't move to the back of the plane, I will have security escort you off." Passengers nearby began to murmur. Some rolled their eyes, assuming the woman had somehow snuck in. A free upgrade attempt perhaps. What they didn't know was that this woman, Ava Thompson, hadn't just boarded the flight with a first-class ticket, she owned the very aircraft they were flying in. Yet, she said nothing of the sort. She simply held her ground with quiet dignity, as Juliet stood firm, certain that Ava didn't belong. Passengers nearby exchanged glances. One whispered, "Maybe she's just trying to get a free upgrade." Another muttered, "Why don't they just check her ticket?" The atmosphere shifted, not loudly or obviously, but in that subtle way that fills the air with tension. The kind of tension that whispers you don't belong here. Ava heard it all, not necessarily the words, but the tone, the undertone of judgment. Still, she didn't flinch. Her posture remained poised, her hands rested in her lap. Her book lay closed beside her. Juliet, now clearly irritated, leaned in with a voice that suggested finality. "I'm asking you one last time to move. Don't make this more difficult than it needs to be." Ava met her gaze, unwavering, and replied calmly, "No, I won't be moving." Her voice wasn't raised, but it carried weight. Then, with chilling precision, she added, "You're making a mistake." That was the moment when everything began to shift. Juliet didn't respond. Instead, she turned on her heel and walked down the aisle, heels clicking like punctuation marks. In her silence, Ava remained composed, silent but not invisible. She reached into her pocket, typed a brief email to the airline's executive operations team, and hit send. No one noticed, except for David Langston, a seasoned businessman seated nearby, who had been observing everything with a quiet, knowing look. He'd seen this before, not on planes, but in boardrooms, where power isn't always loud. It watches, it waits. As Juliet continued her duties, she skipped Ava's row entirely, refusing to offer water or even a glance. When Ava politely asked for a glass of water, Juliet snapped, "I'll get to you when I can," and stormed past. The tension grew heavier, like cabin pressure shifting in mid-flight. The judgment in Juliet's actions wasn't hidden anymore, it had become public. Then, as Juliet returned down the aisle, Ava shifted her leg slightly into the aisle, a natural movement. But Juliet, seeing the opportunity, deliberately struck Ava's shin with her heel. A bottle tipped, and cold water spilled across Ava's lap. Gasps filled the cabin. "Watch where you're putting your legs," Juliet barked. Ava looked down at her soaked pants, brushed the water off gracefully, and responded, "You walked into my leg." Her words weren't angry, but they landed like thunder. Juliet walked away again, jaw clenched. At the back, a younger flight attendant named Grace had witnessed everything. She hovered near the passenger manifest, her fingers inches from the truth, but when Juliet caught her, she warned her not to get involved. Grace hesitated, clearly torn, but stepped back in silence. Ava saw it all. She didn't respond with anger, just quiet resolve. Her head tilted slightly, not in defiance, but as if to say, "I see you." In the quiet hum of the cabin, a storm had already begun. But Ava remained still, letting her presence speak louder than any outburst ever could. Moments after Ava calmly wiped the water from her lap, something in the air shifted, more than discomfort, more than judgment. It was the quiet before a reckoning. Passengers around her exchanged glances. Some stared openly, others buried their faces in magazines or phones, hoping to avoid what they'd just witnessed. Juliet strutted down the aisle again, pretending control, yet a storm brewed beneath her polished demeanor. Then, out of nowhere, she turned sharply and, with a sudden movement fueled by frustration or fear or unchecked bias, she slapped Ava across the face. The sound was sharp, echoing through the cabin like the crack of thunder. Gasps rippled throughout the plane. A fork clattered to the floor. Someone whispered, "Oh my God." David Langston jumped from his seat so fast it startled the passenger behind him. Grace, the young flight attendant, dropped her notepad, her hand flying to her mouth in disbelief. Even the once smug woman in pearls a few rows up suddenly looked away, her confidence shrinking into silence. Juliet stood frozen, her hands still slightly raised as if even she hadn't expected the force of her own actions. Her face paled, her breath caught in her chest. Ava, remarkably, did not flinch. She did not raise her hand to her cheek. She didn't cry or react in anger. She simply looked up and, in a voice low and unshaken, said, "You just made the worst mistake of your life." It wasn't a threat. It was a truth so rooted in reality that the room seemed to tilt around it. Juliet took a step back, her composure unraveling. She looked around the cabin, seeking some form of support, but found only silence and the cold stare of consequences. Passengers were no longer bystanders, they were witnesses. Phones quietly emerged from seatbacks and handbags. Screens lit up, some had started recording. Juliet could feel the shift. The way power had slipped from her grip and now circled Ava like a shield. Desperately, Juliet snapped, "You've been difficult since you boarded, disruptive." David's voice cut in, calm but firm. "She's been composed. You're the one escalating this." Juliet turned to Grace for backup, but the young woman remained still, watching Ava not as a victim, but as a force, unwavering and dignified. Ava exhaled slowly, then opened her bag with deliberate ease, pulled out her phone, tapped a single button, and set it on the armrest. A soft chime sounded. No one knew exactly what she'd done, but everyone understood its meaning. A line had been crossed, and Ava wasn't standing alone anymore. She looked out the window, the sunlight catching her cheekbone, serene even as tension gripped the cabin. Then, from the front of the plane, came the sound of slow, steady footsteps. The cockpit door opened with a hiss, and the captain stepped out. Tall, clean-cut, and composed, though visibly disturbed, his gaze fixed on Juliet. Voice firm, "Miss West, I need to speak to you. Now." Juliet tried to stammer out a defense. "Captain, but he raised a hand to silence her and turned instead to Ava. "Miss Thompson," he said with a respectful nod, "I apologize for the delay." The air in the cabin snapped. Murmurs erupted as the captain addressed the elephant in the room. "For those unaware," he continued, his voice even and clear, "Miss Ava Thompson is not only a guest on this flight. She is the registered owner of this aircraft and the majority shareholder of this airline." Gasps spread through the cabin like sparks. A slow ripple of applause began, not showy or forced, but reverent. Juliet stood as if struck again, her mouth open, the weight of her assumptions crashing down. "This is all a misunderstanding," she stammered. "I didn't know." Ava, face calm, replied, "No, you didn't know, because you didn't care to ask." Juliet stepped forward, voice cracking, "I didn't mean to offend you." Ava didn't raise her tone. "You didn't mean to get caught." The words sliced with precision. "Not cruelty. You made a decision based on bias. You assumed who I was, where I belonged, and treated me accordingly." Juliet's shoulders sagged, her hands hung at her sides. "There are consequences," Ava added, "not because of my title, but because every person on this plane deserves basic dignity." The silence that followed was heavy, not fearful, but solemn. Juliet turned to the captain, perhaps hoping for leniency, but he only looked away. Then, the sound of boots echoed up the jet bridge. Two uniformed officers boarded with measured steps. One addressed Juliet, "Ma'am, we've received a report of physical assault. Please stand." "It was a mistake," she whispered, stunned. "I didn't mean to hurt her." But the cuffs clicked into place. The passengers said nothing. They didn't need to. The reckoning had come, not with shouting or rage, but with clarity, calm, and the still strength of a woman who knew her worth and waited patiently for the world to see it too. As Juliet was led down the aisle in handcuffs, her face drained of color and her eyes searching desperately for sympathy that never came. The cabin remained silent, still processing the power shift they had just witnessed. Passengers no longer saw Ava Thompson as a quiet, possibly out-of-place woman in a navy blazer. Now, they saw her clearly for who she was, the composed, intelligent, quietly commanding majority shareholder of the airline they were flying on. At the front of the plane, a tall man in a gray suit stepped aboard. He wore no badge, but his presence and tailored authority made it obvious he was high up. "Miss Thompson," he began carefully, "I'm Robert Mills, VP of Flight Services. If I may speak." But Ava raised a hand, and the entire cabin felt the shift again. She didn't speak loudly, yet the room quieted. "I own 52% of the board," she said evenly. "There's nothing for you to explain." Robert faltered, lips parting as if to argue, but stopped short. Ava continued, calm but resolute, "I'll be leading the policy review myself. You'll be hearing from my legal team, and from the press office. Let's make sure this is the last time someone in your uniform thinks appearance defines authority." Robert nodded quickly, swallowed, and stepped back without another word. Ava finally rose from her seat, not with fanfare, but with the unshakable presence of someone who had nothing to prove. As she moved down the aisle, she paused in front of Grace, the young flight attendant who had watched everything unfold with growing awareness. "You did the right thing," Ava said gently. Grace's eyes widened in disbelief, then softened with purpose. "You'll be hearing from my office," Ava added, and Grace nodded, a quiet smile forming as if a burden had lifted. Ava returned to her seat, reopened her book, and resumed reading, her presence now commanding not because of her position but because of her unwavering grace under pressure. The cabin remained quiet, but it wasn't the silence of fear. It was the stillness that follows understanding. The businessman, David Langston, wrote on a torn piece of paper, "Integrity looks like her." Behind Ava, the woman in pearls shifted in her seat, uncomfortable, finally looking at Ava not through her or past her, but at her, with silent respect. The flight continued. No one cared about altitude anymore. All eyes were on Ava, not out of spectacle, but admiration. Later, the sound of the engines faded beneath another kind of noise, the sound of news spreading. The footage recorded by passengers didn't focus on the slap or the arrest, but on Ava's quiet strength, her steady voice, the way she had shifted an entire room without ever raising hers. The videos went viral, not with firestorm drama, but like a flame passed gently from candle to candle, quiet, meaningful, unforgettable. Then came the interview. Ava sat in a softly lit studio, poised in her navy suit, hair neatly pulled back. The host leaned in, voice reverent, asking, "Miss Thompson, after everything, what do you hope people take away from this moment?" Ava's answer was simple but profound. "Respect is a right, not a privilege. It shouldn't depend on how you dress, where you sit, or the color of your skin. Dignity doesn't need to be earned. It needs to be protected. And true leadership means ensuring no one has to prove they belong in a space they've already paid to be in." The host swallowed hard, visibly moved. Ava concluded, "I didn't speak to shame anyone. I spoke because silence has carried the weight long enough. It's time for something lighter, something stronger." Her words became a quiet anthem across boardrooms, classrooms, living rooms. Weeks later, Ava boarded a flight again. No cameras, no entourage, just her, walking with the same quiet strength. As she stepped onto the plane, the scent of lavender and leather greeted her. Jazz played softly in the background. Standing at the front, now in crisp uniform and calm confidence, was Grace. She smiled without fear and said, "Welcome aboard, Miss Thompson. It's an honor." Ava returned the smile with a nod that carried depth beyond words. As she walked past passengers, they didn't look through her, they looked at her, not just with recognition, but with respect. She took her seat, the same row, the same view, But this time, something had shifted. The sunlight streamed through the window, casting a soft glow on her cheekbone. She closed her eyes, not from exhaustion or victory, but from peace. Outside, the sky was waking. Amber light brushed the clouds. And somewhere in that light, a quieter world was taking shape, not perfect, not finished, but possible. And for Ava, that was enough. She had changed something, not with force or fury, but with stillness, with courage, and with the kind of strength that never needed to shout. Weeks had passed since the incident that quietly shook the walls of corporate aviation and made headlines without spectacle. Now, under the soft embrace of a golden sunrise, the same aircraft stood on the tarmac, gleaming with polished precision, waiting not for a VIP show, but simply for a woman who had redefined what dignity looks like in silence. Ava Thompson approached the jet bridge alone, no entourage, no cameras, no dramatic music, just her steady presence and unshaken calm. As she stepped aboard, the familiar scent of lavender and rich leather wrapped around her, and the soft jazz playing in the background offered a welcome that was more than just ambience, it was intention. Near the entrance stood Grace, the once timid flight attendant whose eyes now held clarity and quiet pride. Her uniform was crisp, her posture sure, and when she spoke, it was with genuine warmth. "Welcome aboard, Miss Thompson. It's an honor." Ava smiled gently, a smile that needed no explanation, and gave a nod that acknowledged not just Grace's greeting, but the entire journey they had both walked, different paths. Same awakening. Ava walked through the cabin not as a symbol or a statement but as herself, confident, calm, collected. This time, the passengers looked up, not with suspicion or hesitation, but with respect, the kind that runs deeper than recognition. Some eyes softened, some lips curved into small, respectful smiles. No applause, no fanfare, just a collective acknowledgement that something had shifted since the last time she sat here. She took her seat in the same row as before, placed her bag down with deliberate grace, and sank into the leather with a breath of quiet peace. Sunlight filtered through the window, highlighting her cheekbones and casting a soft glow across her composed expression. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, not out of fatigue, but gratitude, not from exhaustion, but from clarity. Outside, the sky began to stir, amber light brushing the clouds, suggesting a day not yet fully formed, a canvas waiting for something better. And in that moment, Ava knew she had contributed to that canvas, not through loud protest or grand declaration, but through stillness, through poise, and through refusing to be diminished by someone else's assumptions. She hadn't chased justice with fury, she had let it rise quietly around her. The way morning overtakes night, not all at once, but inevitably. Her strength had been in her silence, in her restraint, in her clarity when others faltered. She hadn't demanded attention, she'd simply embodied truth until attention had no choice but to listen. The passengers may not have remembered every word she spoke weeks earlier, but they remembered how she made him feel, uncomfortable, inspired, reawakened. They remembered that integrity doesn't wear a label and leadership doesn't always sit in the front row of a boardroom. It sometimes sits quietly in seat 3A, holding a book and a truth too powerful to ignore. In that cabin, policies would change. In that airline, mindsets would shift. But more than that, in the quiet spaces between thoughts, in the subtle rewiring of assumptions, Ava had planted something deeper, an invitation for the world to rethink not just how it sees women, or black women, or leaders, but how it defines worth altogether. Because what she taught that day didn't come from a podium or a press release. It came from choosing grace over reaction, clarity over chaos, and truth over pride. She didn't rewrite history, she simply reminded everyone on board that the rules of dignity aren't reserved for the privileged, they're owed to all. The plane hummed to life, wheels rolling slowly toward takeoff. Passengers settled in, coffee in hand, conversation soft and genuine. Grace moved through the aisles, confident now, her steps purposeful. She no longer looked over her shoulder, She had seen what courage looks like and had decided to carry a piece of it with her. Ava opened her book, her fingers finding the page where she'd last paused, and continued reading. Outside, clouds parted gently for the morning sun and the aircraft lifted from the ground, steady, graceful, and unshaken, just like her. Ava didn't need to say a word. Her presence said everything, and sometimes, that is exactly how change takes flight. In the weeks that followed, Ava Thompson's story did not explode in the way most viral moments do. It unfolded slowly, steadily, like a ripple crossing a still lake, gaining strength not through outrage but through reflection. The video captured by passengers wasn't about drama or scandal. It didn't showcase shouting, conflict, or chaos. What captivated people around the world was Ava's composure, the way she sat still and dignified, the calm in her voice, the unwavering steadiness of someone who had nothing to prove yet everything to teach. Across news networks, social media feeds, corporate boardrooms, and university classrooms, her image began to appear, not adorned in power suits or lights, but sitting silently on a plane, holding a book, commanding an entire room without ever raising her voice. The message wasn't screamed, it was felt. She had allowed truth to rise, and in doing so, reminded people everywhere that silence isn't the absence of power, it can be its most refined form. Eventually, the world wanted to hear from her directly. When the day of the interview came, there was no red carpet, no elaborate setup, just a softly lit studio, a navy backdrop, and Ava herself, poised as always in a simple, elegant suit. Her hair was pulled back neatly, her posture composed, her hands resting lightly in her lap. The host sat across from her, visibly moved before even speaking, and finally asked the question that had been on so many minds, "Miss Thompson, after everything, what do you hope people take away from this moment?" Ava took a breath, not to gather words, but to let silence frame her message. Her response, when it came, was not rehearsed, it was lived. "Respect," she said, "is a right, not a privilege. It should not depend on what you wear, how you speak, where you sit, or the color of your skin. Dignity doesn't have to be earned, it must be protected. And leadership, true leadership, means creating spaces where no one has to prove they deserve to be there." The host nodded, her eyes glassy, and the camera inched closer, capturing Ava's calm intensity. "I didn't speak to shame anyone," Ava continued. "I spoke because silence has carried the weight long enough. We've mistaken quiet tolerance for peace. It's time for something lighter, something stronger." That single line, "Silence has carried the weight long enough," resonated like a bell across the world. It was quoted in editorials, repeated in board meetings, printed on posters in classrooms. But Ava wasn't chasing recognition. She had spoken only because the moment demanded it. And then she had returned to her life, to her work, to her quiet commitment to equity. And yet, something had changed, not just in aviation, not just in corporate policy, but in how people thought about authority, inclusion, and everyday interactions. Stories began to surface, not of grand gestures, but of people pausing before judging, leaders listening more closely, young girls of color sitting a little taller in their seats. Ava had not become a celebrity, she had become a symbol. Not for outrage or retaliation, but for poise, principle, and the enduring power of integrity. In homes where daughters asked their mothers, "Can I be like her?" the answer came faster than ever before. And in boardrooms where executives once spoke over quieter voices, now they asked, "What would Ava do?" In truth, Ava didn't want to be idolized. She wanted people to think, to reflect, to ask better questions, and to listen harder. And so, even as the cameras faded and the attention moved elsewhere, the story remained, not as a fleeting headline, but as a blueprint for how quiet courage can reset the rules. Her presence had filled a cabin once filled with judgment. Her words had redefined who gets to lead. And her silence, anchored, deliberate, unyielding, had done what noise could not. It had changed hearts. Sometimes, Justice doesn't arrive with alarms or chaos. Sometimes, it comes in a whisper. In a woman who doesn't need to shout to be heard. Who sits where she belongs. Opens her book, and lets the world learn by simply watching her be exactly who she is. Several months had passed since the quiet storm that reshaped not only one airline but the collective conscience of countless strangers who bore witness to it. Now, beneath a sky brushed with gold and layered with the soft promise of a new morning, the aircraft once at the heart of that moment stood waiting once more. Nothing seemed extraordinary on the surface. The engines hummed gently. The crew moved with calm professionalism, and passengers filed in one by one with the sleepy rhythm of early travel, but there was something different in the air. Something reverent and unspoken. Ava Thompson arrived at the jet bridge alone. As always, no headlines, no flashing lights, no speech to deliver. Her presence, still and resolute, carried its own weight, one that no uniform or title could bestow. As she stepped aboard the plane, a familiar scent of lavender and soft leather welcomed her like an old friend. The gentle jazz in the background creating a space that felt curated not for show, but for peace. Near the front stood Grace, now a full lead flight attendant, her posture upright, her expression warm, and her nameplate gleaming, not just with rank, but with earned confidence. "Welcome aboard, Miss Thompson," she said with sincere pride. "It's an honor." Ava nodded, her smile subtle but meaningful, a quiet confirmation that Grace's courage had not gone unnoticed. She walked through the cabin slowly, not to be seen, but simply present. Passengers glanced up, not with curiosity or judgment, but with respect. Some recognized her, others sensed her importance through the hush that seemed to follow her steps. She took her seat, not a throne, not a spotlight, but the same row she had once occupied in silence, now reclaimed as her own without needing to defend it. As she settled in, the sun peeked through the window, casting a soft halo on her face, the golden light catching the curve of her cheekbone like a spotlight that asked for no applause. She closed her eyes briefly, not to retreat, but to reflect, to honor not just the battles fought, but the small victories that came quietly after. Around her, the aircraft buzzed with ordinary life, the rustle of seatbelts, the clink of coffee cups, the whispers of travelers heading somewhere unknown. But within it all was a deeper current, a collective understanding that something had shifted, that a new chapter had begun, not with loud declarations, but with quiet insistence. Ava opened her book, the same one she had held months ago, as if to continue a story that the world now understood a little better. Her fingers turned the page, and just like that, she returned to herself, not as the woman who made headlines, but as the woman who never needed them. Grace moved down the aisle with renewed purpose, her steps measured, her gestures kind. She no longer questioned her role or her voice. She had seen what dignity looked like when the world tried to erase it, and she had chosen, from that day forward, to protect it. Other members of the crew watched her with admiration, not because she had witnessed history, but because she had grown through it. Ava's presence had not only transformed a moment, it had changed people. It had rewritten policies, yes, but more importantly, it had planted seeds in the minds of those who once whispered, who once assumed, who once looked through instead of at. Now they watched with new eyes, eyes that had learned. Not everything had been fixed, discrimination still existed, biases still lingered, but for the first time, the passengers on this flight sat in a space where they knew the price of assumption and the value of pause. And perhaps that was enough, for now. The plane began to taxi, wheels turning gently as the sky opened before them. Outside, clouds swirled like soft brushstrokes of possibility. Inside, Ava gazed out the window, not in search of something, but in quiet recognition of what had already begun. She didn't need vindication, she didn't need gratitude. The greatest victory had always been the return to stillness, the kind of stillness that holds power, wisdom, and legacy. And as the aircraft lifted gently from the ground, ascending into the amber-hued sky, Ava turned another page in her book, her expression unchanged, Her presence unmistakable. No longer just the woman who had once been questioned, she was now the measure by which others would define what it means to lead with grace. Ava Thompson never set out to become a symbol, nor did she seek the spotlight that eventually followed her quiet strength. Yet what she sparked continued to ripple far beyond that single flight. Far beyond the polished cabin walls or boardroom statements, it reached into the folds of everyday life. Where change truly lives, her name became not just a headline but a reference point. A lesson in leadership taught not through dominance but dignity. In classrooms, her story was discussed as part of character education. Students, especially young girls of color, saw themselves reflected in her composure and courage, asking questions about fairness, voice, and the quiet power of presence. Teachers found in her story a new way to teach empathy, not as a concept but as a practice. Rooted in Ava's choice to respond with grace when every instinct would have excused anger. In boardrooms, her calm refusal to be diminished reshaped diversity training and redefined what executive presence looked like. HR departments no longer just referenced policies, they referenced Ava. Her actions showed that accountability doesn't have to roar, it can speak in measured, confident truths that reshape institutions. On social media, her interview clips were shared not in outrage but in reverence, often with captions like, "This is how you carry power," or, "Dignity looks like this." Artists painted murals of her with quotes about respect, and authors cited her in essays about modern leadership and feminine strength. But perhaps her greatest legacy wasn't in the systems she disrupted or the headlines she inspired. It was in the thousands of quiet changes made by ordinary people who began seeing the world differently after witnessing her stillness. Flight attendants treated passengers with a more mindful awareness. Strangers in coffee shops second-guessed their assumptions. Men in suits thought twice before interrupting women in meetings. Daughters walked taller. Sons listened more closely. It wasn't Ava's wealth or her title that had changed them. It was the unwavering example she had set in a moment of fire. Choosing not to burn but to illuminate. Her story reminded people that justice is not always loud, that strength is not always aggressive, and that leadership sometimes means choosing restraint over reaction. When asked later in a follow-up interview how she processed the global reaction to her story, Ava answered simply, "I'm glad it reached people. But I hope what they remember most isn't me. It's how they felt when they saw someone refuse to be reduced." That line became etched into the culture, not on plaques or monuments, but in conversations, decisions, and quiet moments of pause before judgment. Even in places far removed from the corporate elite, her story lived on. In barbershops where elders told younger generations about dignity, in libraries where girls borrowed her biography for school reports, in churches where sermons mentioned her name not as a heroine but as a mirror reflecting the best of us. Ava never released a memoir, never ran for office, never launched a movement. She didn't need to. Her impact wasn't structured, it was lived. One changed mindset at a time. In time, the airline she owned evolved as well. They revised not just training manuals but internal culture, using Ava's experience as a framework for respect-centered leadership. Grace, the once hesitant flight attendant who had watched that day unfold with a racing heart, was now head of in-flight training, mentoring others with the same integrity she had once seen in Ava. And passengers, even those who never knew the full story, could feel the difference. There was more listening now, more apology when needed, more awareness, not perfection, but progress. Ava Thompson became a name people spoke with softness. Not because she was fragile, but because reverence often sounds like silence. Her face was not on posters plastered in airports, but her presence lingered in the subtle behaviors of crews and passengers alike. Years later, when someone on a flight stood up against a microaggression, a fellow traveler nodded and said quietly, "That's an Ava moment," and everyone around understood, not because it was dramatic, but because it was right. Ava, who had once simply taken her seat and opened a book, had redefined what it meant to belong, not just on a plane, but in every space where worth had to battle assumption. Her legacy was not built in noise, But in stillness, and still, it moved mountains.